Hello, this is Richard Lund, coming to you from Los Angeles. I'm on a journey to live a healthy 100 years. Why not come along with me? Today we've got something to talk about. It's those headlines you see, and sometimes they're in a meme, and it's a real short message, and it usually has something that you can either agree with or disagree with. And often they claim, the person that wrote this, that there's some real proof behind it. So we're going to look at that today. Let's take a look. Headlines, science or nonsense. Now, I have listened to the particular fellow that I'm going to bring up in a second here. His name is Dr. Buttar, and I don't really understand whether he thinks that COVID-19 is caused by vaccines or like flu vaccines or not, but I'll just play a little bit and just so you have an idea of what he's saying.
The second thing is every testing modality right now has been shown to have false positives, and now multiple studies that go as recently as 2018 all the way back to 1984 show that people that had or subjects, whether it's mice model, rat model, or even in humans, when they were given the flu shot, they tested positive for coronavirus, they tested positive for COVID-19. So of course you're going to have a high elevated synthetic elevation of these positive numbers.
So, of course, we're going to have a high elevation of these positive numbers. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think that's right. But what do I know? I've only lived, 69 years in this body, and I've had a bunch of vaccines over the years. I work as Santa at Christmas time. And as a result, I've decided to get flu vaccines because I'm going to have contact with a lot of little kids. So I just feel it's important to try to protect myself, and because, if I get sick, I can't work, and then I disappoint a lot of people. But that's neither here nor there for right now. Let's just go back to our story. There's another one I've seen recently. It's the headline, "The Pentagon Study, a flu shot raises the risk of coronavirus by 36%. Now, can you imagine who might say that? It's quoting a study, and at first I thought, it can't be a study like that. Well, there is a study like that, and it was brought to you by this guy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He was the one that made it public. Now, I sort of played with this picture a little bit. He doesn't look that bad normally, I think. I just made him appear as if he was in some kind of a photo from the police or something like that. So let's just make him look better. That's the way he normally looks. So I was just trying to show you that you can manipulate images that you see, and it might have an influence on how you feel about the image. So let's go with his article that appears on his website. It says, in searching the literature, the only study we've been able to find assessing flu shots and coronavirus is a 2020 U.S. Pentagon study that found that the flu shot increases the risks from coronavirus by 36%. Then he quotes the study, receiving influenza vaccine may increase the risk of other respiratory viruses, a phenomenon known as virus interference. Vaccine-derived virus interference was significantly associated with coronavirus. And here are the findings. Well, that's pretty scary, isn't it? It's like if we're all supposed to stay away from each other and we're supposed to protect ourselves, and then we got a flu shot and it's going to make us more likely to get sick. Wow, that's bad. And he goes on, examining non-influenza viruses specifically, the odds of coronavirus in vaccinated individuals were significantly higher when compared to unvaccinated individuals with an odds ratio, that's OR in the literature, of 1.36. So, in other words, the vaccinated were 36% more likely to get coronavirus. Well, let's see what the Pentagon says. Oh, wow. Look at that headline up there. White against red. 2020 Pentagon study, flu vaccines increase risk of coronaviruses by 36%. Well, that's a scary title, isn't it? Only that's not the title of the article. The article it's published in a journal called Vaccine. The author was G.Wolff. And I don't know Mr. Wolff, but I assume that he's told the truth. This is a peer-reviewed journal, and he has submitted, and it's been peer-reviewed, and then it's been published. So it talks about this respiratory virus interference. And they tested a number of people from the Department of Defense personnel during the 2017-2018 influenza season. Now, the DoD has soldiers all around the world that it has to protect, and that force protection includes things like vaccines. So I didn't ever get the malaria vaccine, but people who go into the military often get vaccinated against malaria because they might have to go on a short notice to some place in the world where that's a problem illness. And so we want to protect those people that are in the Army or in the Marines or Special Forces or Navy or whoever they are. And of course, vaccines are the way they are protected. We'll go on a little bit. Now, every article has an abstract. So just imagine that you have, it's sort of like the breakdown, the short version of what the research or whatever they're talking about. If it's a review article, it'll be a short summary of what's in there. And in this case, it talks about the purpose. It talks about what they found and also the conclusions. And we'll show you that in a minute. But just understand that reading a science journal is not entirely difficult. Sometimes you can't read it because the data or the article will be there in the abstract form, but then the rest of the article is not there unless you pay for it. And many times I've looked for things, wanted to read them, and I've been offered it maybe on the low end at $4 for 6 hours of time, so I can read something like in the journal Cell, or in many other journals. There'll be a paywall that's much higher. They want $40 or 40 pounds sterling or something like that, just for me to read what's published. Now I get a little irritated at that because, especially when the research has been funded by the U.S. taxpayer, that really steams me. But that's just my opinion. So, you don't have to worry too much about an old man who's sitting in front of a microphone. We're getting steamed up about not being able to read our journal articles. But I'm just saying that, you can go to pubmed.gov, which is a National Library of Medicine website, and you can look up these things and you can read at least the abstract and oftentimes the whole article. Sometimes you have to read what's called the author's manuscript. That might be made available publicly. And then the final reviewed copy, which is controlled by the journal itself. You might not be able to read that. So that's where we stand. Now, I understand that there's a policy that when the U.S. government pays for something, that the journal must reveal it to the public within 1 year of publication. In this case, it does show up, so I didn't have to wait. I could read the whole thing, and which is good to do, because sometimes when people claim that something is proved by a scientific study, when you read the study, it turns out that that wasn't proved at all. And sometimes the opposite is true. So that's where we are. So let's go back. So here's the abstract, and I'll break it down a little bit to make it easier. This is the purpose. So again, receiving the influenza vaccination may increase the risk of other respiratory viruses, a phenomenon known as virus interference. So this study is going to talk about virus interference. That's what they're investigating. And they actually have a little over 6,000 Defense Department personnel involved in this study. There were more than that. There were about 9,000 originally, but they eliminated some for various reasons. And this all has to do with whether or not they were vaccinated by the influenza strain that was put in the vaccine in the 2017 and 2018 flu season, so that 1 year period. That's how this thing was set up. Then the results are there, and it talks about that. We can talk about that in a little while. We'll have the actual final data that we can look at the the chart, table 5, it's called. There's a term in there. You notice a little bit above the underlining. There's a term pan-negative controls. So these are people that did not have any illness during that period of time, but they were still sourced from a similar group of people. So those are people that got immunized, but they didn't get sick. That's the idea. So the conclusions of this article written by the person and approved by the journal are the receipt of influenza vaccination was not associated with virus interference among our population. That was the people in the military who were vaccinated. Examining virus interference by specific respiratory viruses showed mixed results. Vaccine-derived virus interference was significantly associated with coronavirus and human metapneumovirus. Well, okay. So that does what Kennedy said earlier seems to be lifted from this summary, from this conclusion. However, the author goes on, significant protection from vaccination was associated not only with most influenza viruses, but also parainfluenza, RSV, and non-influenza virus co-infections. So it's saying that there is a good reason to get vaccinated, and there's a good reason to keep soldiers be vaccinated, and that's something we need to keep in mind. So let's go on. So the study came out officially in 2020. Remember the headline we saw earlier, 2020 Pentagon study, and that red box around the article. But is it talking about the coronavirus that causes COVID-19? Now, one would think that by just looking at the headline that the coronavirus that's around right now, giving people lots of trouble, making lots of people die, 1 million people maybe in the United States by this date sick with this. Of course, people are arguing whether that's true or not. But I'm just going to say, well, that's the official figure put out by the government. So for now, we'll just accept that for argument's sake. That one is that virus is called SARS-CoV-2. And there are some other viruses that could be tested for in 2017 and 18 when the study was conducted that are also called coronaviruses. And they would be 4 other less severe ones. And they're the 229E, the NL63, the OC43, and the HKU1. Now, before this season, before, let's say, February of this year, I had never heard of any of those. And I didn't realize that people could get infected by those 4 coronaviruses. And they actually usually come up, as far as symptoms, head cold, much like you get with rhinovirus. And sometimes, once in a while, they get really serious and go into the lungs and get trouble, but most of the time, they're fine. And during this time of this study, remember that was studied in 2017 and 2018, those were the ones that could be studied. Now, no one had seen SARS-CoV-2 at that time. Of course, if you want to believe people like Dr. Buttar, maybe he would say that, well, maybe they did have it then and they were just hiding it, or they were, using, I don't want to go down the rabbit trails of every idea that's out there, but the scary feelings that we have now would not have caused any major concern when this paper was written. Nobody would have put a red box around the paper and said, look, we have a real serious problem here, because if you get vaccinated for the flu, you're going to get this other sickness, or at least a 36% more chance of getting it than somebody else. So coronaviruses 229E, the OC43, and the HKU1 use a different receptor to invade cells in the body. That means that spike protein that you've heard about that connects with the tissue, the cell itself, and through some other mechanisms ends up allowing the virus particle inside the RNA to enter the cell and duplicate itself using the cell's mechanism, uses a different door. Now, there is the one of these 4, the NL63, does use the ACE2 receptor. to enter just like SARS-CoV-2 does and SARS-CoV-1. But this paper doesn't distinguish which one was which. They just have a general category. So at the time, I don't know what test they were using. I don't know how that worked, and I don't know whether we could have told the difference between those four. Maybe we can't. Maybe we don't know. So we'll just say we don't know. But that big red border said what it said. It was just misleading. Pentagon study, 2020, flu vaccines increase risk of coronavirus by 36%. And when you see that, that's a headline. And that's not even the headline. That's not even the title of the paper, not even the title of the study, but it's something scary. And they put it in red because they want you to feel scared. It's a danger signal, right? So, G.Wolff submitted the paper on the 20th of June, 2019. But Kennedy made the 2020 as part of his headline. 2020, Pentagon study. And G.Wolff, 20 of June 2019. You see the little box there, the article info. Now, this also usually is given when you have a journal article published. They'll say when they received the paper, and if they've received a revised version, which is after the reviewers review it, they send it back to the original authors. In this case, there's one author, and ask for revisions or suggest revisions, and then those are made or not made or argued about, and they're sent back. So this is what we call peer review. We get a chance for people who know something about the subject to take a look at it and make suggestions or make criticisms so that the paper has better information for us. That's why we have peer-reviewed articles in journals. And if they're not peer-reviewed, sometimes they're just a letter written or a communication. And during the last few months, most of the things that we have seen appearing in journals are not peer-reviewed because that takes time. You notice when it was revised and submitted on the 30th of September, the next day it was accepted. And then, by the 10th of October, 2019, it was available online. That meant that people could read it, and people could read its final form. It wasn't 2020. Now, officially, the publication date might have been 2020, as if, when the paper journal was printed and put in the libraries. But as far as the actual work, it was finished by June so I'll call it 30th of September, and there it was available. Remember, we got Mr. Kennedy here making it 2020, making it part of this year's work, this year's news, when in reality, I don't trust the guy. So that's why I made this second version of this picture that is credited to Gage Skidmore. I didn't take the picture, but Gage did. And I put his name down there in red to make it scarier, make him look like a more dangerous guy, even though he's not really dangerous, except if he provides misdirection in his information about important things about our health. That's why I would think it would be somebody I would not want to have a high regard for and listen to in regard to how he reports the science, facts, the information that's out there. Now let's take a look at Table 5. You notice we have a list on the left side of the viruses that are going to be measured. Then we have the people who are vaccinated, and it shows up the number of people vaccinated and in the brackets the percentage of them who showed up with that infection. And then we have the next column over those who are not vaccinated and their percentage of infection. And then the third one over from there, the OR, which means the odds ratio, that would be between those two groups. So those who are infected, those who are not infected. And remember, everyone in the vaccinated column are people who were vaccinated. Everyone in the not vaccinated column are those who did not get vaccinated against the flu virus, the mixture that was put out in the vaccine of 2017-2018. And then on the far right, you have what's called a p-value. Now, many of you hearing this may completely understand p-value, and it's just a matter of how strongly that the evidence is there so that there's a difference between those who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated. In most of the things here, it was less than 0.01, which means there's a very high confidence that this is true data. I didn't review how all of that was figured out, but let's just say that that usually is done. So let's take a look at some details here. I've underlined some lines here. So we have the influenza originally there, and you have 31.3% of those vaccinated got that particular virus, this regular influenza virus, and those not vaccinated got 44.4%, had that one show up during that year. So that's an odds ratio of 0.57. So that means that it's a lot better to get vaccinated if you're trying to avoid that particular virus than if you don't get vaccinated. Now, if you go down to the next underlined line, the coronavirus, you see there were 7.8% of the vaccinated that showed up with that virus during that year, and 5.8% of the non-vaccinated. So the non-vaccinated still got it, and the vaccinated got it more often. And again, we know that it was one of those four coronaviruses that causes a head cold, usually. And that 1.36 number on the odds ratio is where you get the 36% more having the coronavirus and the metapneumovirus. Now, the metapneumovirus is actually even higher than that. It's 1.51, so that is 51% greater chance. But then when you look at all the other viruses except one, you have a reduction. So, and there's another one I've underlined. It's called no pathogen detected. It has an OR of 1.59. So you have a 59% better chance with vaccination of no viral infection. You know, it's sort of funny why Kennedy didn't even touch that. I know he must have looked at this table because he got his 1.36 number out of this. But one would think that if he was going to report fairly, he would tell the whole story. And I think he had an agenda of just trying to convince people with his quick thinking that this is scary, and if you're afraid of the coronavirus in 2020, that you certainly wouldn't want to ever get a flu vaccine because that would raise your chances of getting it, and that would be terrible. I mean, that's the conclusion. That's what he's aiming for, and I think that's wrong. And I've showed you why. I think it's not wrong. It's wrong from the standpoint of the science side of it, or at least it's questionable, because we don't actually know how this, we don't know if the flu vaccine that you're going to get this year coming up, or the one that we just have received from this past year, has any influence on coronavirus of this CoV-2 type. So the conclusion is here from Mr. Wolff's work. And I just want to jump down to the bottom of it here, the last paragraph. The overall results of this study showed little or to no evidence supporting the association of virus interference and influenza vaccination. Remember, we showed you those 2 or 3 that were increased in this particular study, and there were several others. I forgot how many, but at least a dozen that were decreased that had a number below 1. So it says, additionally, those receiving the influenza vaccine were more likely to have no pathogen detected and reduced risk of influenza when compared to unvaccinated individuals. Now, people have been talking about how the flu, the seasonal flu, is more dangerous, or at least as dangerous as the COVID-19. And we don't really know that yet, exactly how dangerous COVID-19 is, because we had poor data coming out of China. I don't think anyone thinks that their data was good, except maybe Mr. Tedros with the WHO. And then we had a little bit of preliminary data from the Diamond Princess, and that was, a lot of old people. That was a terrible experiment to run, but it happened to be done, so we can learn from it. And we've had other ships like the Roosevelt, where there was one sailor who lost his life, and there were about 600 who were infected, and many of them recovered and are doing well, as far as I understand. So we don't have complete data, and we're not going to get complete data until we get out a year or two. We can look back and we can see really how many people died and how many people were infected and how many people built antibodies with no symptoms and so forth. We really don't know. And I think we were, personally, this is just an opinion of mine, that we were wise to wait and try to protect our nation and our elderly in particular by all these terrible measures that we had to go through. So my original statement was, or quoting someone, maybe I wasn't even quoting them correctly, who knows, but vaccines give you COVID-19 and studies prove it. It is nonsense. It's not true. So what we've got is a problem of, especially in social media, of just seeing something or hearing someone talk about something as if they know what they're talking about, me included. Okay, I have a bachelor's degree in biology from the 1970s. What does that prove? Not that I know much. I've learned a lot more about virology this year than I've ever known in my life. But it's still a case of, I know that I can read science journals. I've been doing it for years. Sometimes I understand what is said. Sometimes I don't. And when I don't, I can look things up and I can try to understand that way. And of course, there are going to be outside-the-box thinkers that are, could be completely wrong, could be right, I suppose, if we want to be generous. I think of Dr. Judy Mikovits comes to mind. I've tried to listen to her. There are times when she seems to have a good presentation, seems to be logical. I mean, she tends to kind of move everything into this XMRV mouse virus that she studied and is sure that causes a lot of things. I don't know. But we get Dr. Buttar and I know he's sure that the waves from the 5G towers are going to turn something on in our bodies that make us sicker, destroy our health. There are numbers of other people. I just saw a quotation on Facebook yesterday, in fact, as I was preparing the notes for this, where someone was quoting a scientist from Japan saying that virus that is infecting us is definitely created in a lab and that natural viruses couldn't possibly do what this one's doing. But unfortunately for the person posting this, that doctor from Japan didn't ever say any of that. And that it just, it makes up things like that the Dr. Hanjo worked at the lab in Wuhan for 4 years and knew everybody there, and now can't get any of them on the phone, and all of them are dead. And this virus, because it makes people sick in Switzerland and it makes people sick in Singapore, therefore it can't be a natural virus. I mean, these are the kind of statements being made, especially it's sort of weird because then when the person is checked on, I mean, I decided, well, I'll go to PubMed and see what this fellow learns about and where he works. It's very clear that he works in Japan. He doesn't work at the lab in Wuhan, China. He hasn't been there for 4 years. The lab hasn't been there for a lot of years. I mean, I don't remember when it started exactly, but the present structure of that lab, I think, is maybe 7 or 8 years old. So, and this researcher from Japan, has been studying cancer and been studying the PD-1 pathway, and he's not been studying viruses and creating Frankenviruses. I mean, this kind of stuff gets reported, and the person that I tried to point this out to doesn't accept my comments because, of course, I must be wrong because they read it somewhere or they heard it somewhere or whatever. And I've decided, not in this case yet, but I have decided for some other people that it's best for me to unfriend them because I'm just going to be sarcastic or mean or hurt their feelings or whatever. But it's still a case where truth does matter. We've been arguing back and forth a lot in our society about, it usually boils down to whether we hate Trump or love Trump. I don't hate or love Trump. He's the president currently, and we'll see who the other side has as their candidate. And I suppose I'll have to decide if I want to vote for either one or nobody, which might happen. Last time around, I couldn't vote for either because I had to go away out of state to a funeral, and was just at the time when the election was happening. So I didn't vote for Trump then, and I didn't vote for Hillary, and I'm not sure. I don't know if I had actually been able to vote, who I would have voted for. I don't actually know, and it's okay, to be undecided. And sometimes, I remember back in college, one of our professors taught me a very valuable lesson, which I think I've seen, proved out, is that people vote their pocketbooks. So, people that think that this disaster financially that's created around the world because China didn't tell us the facts of the story early enough, or even now is not really telling us the truth about it, which I think those statements are fairly accurate. I mean, I've heard Ian Lipkin say that he was told by researchers in universities in China in the middle of December that there was a problem, and then he went there in January. I don't know why he delayed, but he had to get there somehow. And then another source, which is Matthew Tai, I believe his name is, and he has a channel called Lao I-86, and he also has. It was the other fellow, Sturzel. Serpent ZA is his channel. He had an interview with a fellow who also was told, somebody who lives in China, an English speaker, who was told by someone who he knew in person because he didn't want to do it over social media. It was prior to Christmas Eve, that would be before the 24th of December of this last year, that there was a problem and that he should get some, the things that we need, masks and gloves and sanitizers and so forth, and get those because there was going to be this thing happening. So it's fairly obvious to me that we have two sources I've named there, and those can be checked on by people. The interview was with Vincent Rock and Yellow on his program TWIV with Ian Lipkin. So, and that's out there. I mean, people can listen to it. It was an unforced discussion. This other one was, provided that I have no reason to disbelieve the report from this person who lives in a city somewhere in Hubei province. So there are what we call facts, and then we have the interpretation of facts, and then we come up with some conclusions. I had dedicated this video to Jonas Salk. As a child, I received the Salk polio vaccine, or maybe I should say Salk. I think that's how it's pronounced. And then later I had the Sabin oral vaccine, which came in, I think we had to have 2 doses, if I remember correctly. So those things changed the world in which I lived. The little girl who had crutches in my grade school class, she was a lovely little girl, but she could only walk around with crutches and leg braces. And later in my life, in my teenage years, I had to wear a brace in my back for a couple of years. And it was a disgusting set of events as far as, it was unpleasant. I couldn't take a bath. I think I had one bath in 2 years. Spit baths were the only thing I could do. As a young man, you know, my body was changing. In early, I guess it was 8th and 9th grade, so starting to sweat and stink, and we didn't have good deodorants back in those days. It was a pretty unpleasant thing, and so polio. I heard about iron lungs. Now, a lot of people in those days got polio and got over it. But there were some that had severe complications, neurological problems, and had to be put into what was called an iron lung. And it was a great big tank, and I suppose some kind of rubber bladder that would sort of force the inhalation of air into the lungs. And laying like that and having to be fed and looking up at people on your back for either a number of months or maybe sometimes for years or maybe sometimes only for a few weeks. But that's still a very serious complication. Losing the ability to walk correctly is a serious complication. Smallpox, that was a very deadly disease, and that was cured by vaccination. We certainly had other good things that happened, which like sanitation. So I've heard people like Dr. Shiva talk about how sanitation improved our lives, and it's generally true. And I heard something from Vince Racaniello this today about a particular. I don't remember the details, but I'm just saying that sanitation turned up to make it harder for us to get over that because we didn't have exposure to it when we had our mother's antibodies. But that's another story. So I'm on rabbit trails here. So my point is this: when you hear a claim made by somebody who has a PhD or doctor or whatever their title is, osteopathic doctor in this case of Batar, or PhD in the case of Judy Mikovits, they aren't necessarily wrong because they're a minority or a unique voice. That doesn't make them wrong. But it would be better for them to show us the data and show us why they believe what they believe, instead of just, telling stories. Telling stories. Well, people love stories, don't we? We love to hear a story. And there's a pastor, Paul Vanderklay, who talks about the multiverse, no, not multiverse, what does he say? I think he says the universe. I'm getting it wrong. I better get my stories straight. But he talks about the storyverse as one of the things. So we have what we see objectively and measure in the world, and then we have the stories we tell about that. And that's something that we need to understand, that we're drawn to stories, especially stories that have a hero. So if you have Judy Mikovits, she's this heroine who, saves the day, figures out how to treat, I guess she calls it AIDS as a disease, and we have some of these other voices that are saying, well, that AIDS isn't actually caused by HIV, and there's no causative factor, or that Ebola is, Judy, I believe, presented the idea that Ebola was created in the lab in Frederick, Maryland, and then sent to Africa somehow. And also, the coronavirus somehow was created in a lab. I don't know. I think the stories sometimes vary, and so I can't say that I really have a definitive description of her beliefs. But it troubles me because she is taking on the entire field. Now, what do I know about scientific research? I've learned a little bit by my friend Dr. McLaughlin, and I remember talking to some of the people that were his grad students, trying to get sources for a book that I was contemplating writing, and that it was hard for them to speak clearly to me about what they thought of Dr. McLaughlin's research because they still had to get research funding. They still had to be able to gain support for their work, and so they had to be careful. And I get it. Or they were maybe working for a pharmaceutical company, and again, they had to be careful about what they would say because it would affect their lives and their futures and their own working life. So we understand that. But just because someone who is emphatic and sure that they're right says something doesn't mean they are right. It's been on my heart for a while to make these statements today. And I thank you for listening. It's really appreciated the interest that you have in my channel and what I've been talking about. So I have to remember that these days we are appropriately saying, let's see, how does it go? I get it right. Stay well, stay safe, and keep your distance.